of fun tonight. I want to introduce our speaker, Nicki Green. I'm going to read a little bit about our speaker, who's an amazing artist. I'm going to read her bio, but then I want to tell you something else about her. Nicki Green is a transdisciplinary artist working primarily in clay. Her sculptures, ritual objects, and various flat works explore topics of history, preservation, conceptual ornamentation, and the aesthetics of otherness. She explores material and object integrity by utilizing transness as a lens with which to look at the world. She has exhibited internationally, notably at the New Museum, New York, Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris, France. Green is a 2022 Nancy Graves Foundation grantee, a 2020 Art Matters Fellow, 2019, I guess this is San Francisco MoMA SCCA Award finalist, a lot of letters there, among others. She received a BFA from San Francisco Art Institute in 2009 and an MFA from UC Berkeley in 2018. She is currently a visiting professor at California State University, Long Beach Center for Contemporary Ceramics. And this is what I want to tell you about Nicki. So I was just laying on the couch reading the Jewish Forward, and I read this amazing article about her and her work. And I immediately wrote to her and said, could we have an exhibit, either a physical exhibit or sometimes, something online? Because she's a sculptor, online is a little bit easier because it doesn't involve shipping her work. So, and she immediately wrote back in just the most gracious way, and I felt like a rock star. I just wrote to a rock star, and she just was like right there, and she just answered me. And so this has been in the works. That article appeared around Rosh Hashanah, right? It was I think it was for the High Holy Days. And so it's been many months in the making, and I could not be more delighted to have her here, to be able to have Charter Oak host this wonderful evening. And I'm so glad each and every one of you is here. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our dear Charter Oak family, Nicki Green.
Oh, thank you, Donna, so much for such a lovely invitation. And this is just so special. And thank you and everyone at Charter Oak. This is such a blessing to get to connect with you all and chat about my work a bit. And I think the plan is that I'm going to work through some slides, and I'm going to talk through my art practice. And then once we sort of get towards the end of that, would love to kind of open it up and chat with folks if there are questions or thoughts, would love to hear them. So thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see. Get these slides going. Can you see this full screen? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm thinking about this talk. I'm referring to this talk as Bodies, 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 or Good News, I Just Made a Golem. I will talk about sort of like where that comes from in a sec. But I think introducing, and for me, like contextualizing my practice in this way right now because of a recent kind of dramatic shift in the presence and absence of the figure in my sculptural practice. It's something I've sort of played with for many years, and it's something that's sort of come up a lot. So I'm really thinking a lot about presence and absence of bodies. And I'll just say that, I'm trans and I'm Jewish. My genealogy is very Ashkenazi. My family is from Poland, Ukraine, Russia. And so I make my artwork, I sort of engage my art practice as a way of kind of investigating those, I would say, identities, but also just ways of being in the world. These really inform how I think about being in a body. And so I use my art practice to explore that subjectivity. Okay, so let's jump in. So this is the reference for Good News. I just made a golem. This is Sophia Zohar, who has quite a presence on Twitter and is often articulating some really kind of humorous and also, I think, kind of profound ideas around kind of contemporary Jewish practice. And then as an artist herself, she's often talking about the ways in which Jewishness and visual practice intersect each other. So this idea of like these histories of Jewishness articulating like why one shouldn't create a golem, and how like every Jewish artist is like, good news, I just made a golem, that I just find so funny. And then this is me in my studio this past summer. This is at Cal State Long Beach, where I moved to Southern California from the Bay Area to build these human-sized figures for an exhibition in Lyon, France. And I sort of find this image so uncanny and uncomfortable and kind of exciting to be surrounded by these like enormous bodies. Okay, so so I think like when I've talked about my work in the past, let me see if I can, okay, there we go. When I've talked about my work in the past, I've often thought about it in a sort of linear, like a linear evolution of my art practice. And I think I find this intuitive, like an intuitive way to talk about my art practice, because for me in particular, each piece and really each body of work that I make builds on the last body of work or the last piece, and is really this kind of accumulation of a lifetime of research. And I really think of my research as being both academic, but also in the studio, that like the act of making feels research-based to me. But also things like watching TV or kind of like consuming kind of cultural material feels like an act of research. And then similarly, as I've come into my relationship with Jewishness sort of differently as I've gotten older, that sort of exploration of Jewishness and ritual practice feel like research, and I'm sort of exploring it all in the studio. So I'm starting here with actually I would say this is some of my most recent work. And I'm starting with most recent work because I think I'm often most excited about or most interested in what is happening in the studio at the current moment. And while like in the past, I tend to work in this kind of linear trajectory of like, this is the origin of this kind of body of work, it feels important to kind of bounce around. I'm really, I think with this talk, trying to think about the presence and absence of bodies in my work, because these human-sized figures feel like such a kind of divergent exploration. I think I've also spent a very long time avoiding making dimensional figurative work. I have like a drawing and painting practice, and you'll see sort of how that intersects as I move through some of these pieces. But this was really the first time I started making like physical sculptures of bodies, and it really felt like kind of risky and scary. I think there's a real kind of expectation of what a figure is or what a figure does in the world, or like in, I guess, art making. And those expectations tend to focus on things like proportion, like lifelikeness, all of these specific things that are about both like skill and relationship to making. And so I've always felt sort of like disinterested in things like precision is something that I find relatively flat for my own practice. Like I'm more interested in kind of like sloppiness or out of proportionness, et cetera, et cetera. So I really like avoided the figure because there were so many expectations around that. And this was really kind of a first jump in. Here are, let's see, details of this piece. And I think with this work, I'm trying to think about, in recognizing that real desire to like avoid making figures, like what does it mean to both desire these objects in space or want to kind of bring them into the world, but also like to have this instinct to kind of avoid it. I think that I'm just interested in interrogating that discomfort rather than letting it kind of exist just how it is. I think I'm also like with the presence of these figures, I'm starting to ask myself about what it means to both bring a figure into the world, so the presence of a figure versus the absence of a figure, which is really, I think, how I had engaged my practice and engaged figuration in the past. So I made these pieces, these three figures, these two on the screen, and then the one that I just showed for the Lyon Biennale that is actually about to close in a couple weeks in Lyon, France. The theme of the Biennale is manifesto of fragility. And so I'm really, I was really interested in thinking about the fragility of bodies, but also the fragility of sort of boundaries, boundariedness. And I have been making for many, many years, a lot of work, sculptural work about mikvah and sort of various ritual bathing practices. And so for this body of work, I was really interested in bringing the participants of the ritual bath into space rather than making the bath itself or objects that reference the bath itself. I think like for this work, I was considering how the presence of ritual participants sort of implicate the environment around them. So by putting these objects into like a gallery or an exhibition space, the exhibition space itself becomes a ritual space just by its context. I think also the relationship to architecture feels significant here and is something that I'm really continuing to think about. So in a lot of my research around mikvah and around ritual cleansing, I guess, ritual bathing, I had been finding evidence of queer and transgender Jews using mikvah to mark and engage, kind of affirm transitional moments in their lives, in our lives, which is not unlike cisgender and heterosexual participants who use mikvah. But there was something kind of profound about the idea of queer and trans Jews using a space that's so charged for our bodies to affirm transness and to affirm queerness. So I had spent, like I said, I had spent years, many years making vessels that spoke about bathing and the baths themselves as tools. I've been really interested in the construction of ritual objects for queer and trans Jews. And I think that like with this work, it just felt like it was time to bring in the participants to sort of not continue only making these kind of like disembodied objects that maybe were considering the absence of a participant, but to actually just bring these participants in. So I think with this piece in particular, but really with like making bodies in general, it feels like a hugely complicated experience in representing trans bodies, transgender bodies, and especially naked transgender bodies, putting them into a space that these bodies, or like I as a artist, don't have really control over. They go out into space and then viewers come see them. I think this piece in particular, which I sort of refer to as like the immersee, or like the participant, the body who is immersing in the mikvah, is making a particularly like kind of intense spectacle of the body, which is interesting because in a sort of normative mikvah immersion, there's very little sort of exposure of the body. Like one is naked, but there is this kind of relationship to privacy and interiority as somebody immerses in water. And so to pull these participants out of the context and really the safety, I guess that's kind of a complicated idea, but really like the proximity of the interior of a mikvah or like ritual space really changes the relationship to safety and visibility. This piece I think of as sort of embodying like the choreography of immersion, and this kind of inherent reveal and conceal of the body itself. Let's see. So the gaze of the viewer feels really important with this new work. And I mean, I think with all work, there's a relationship to the gaze of a viewer, but making these bodies, the gaze feels significantly more present. And, you know, I did that also with the relationship to the eyeballs. Like with this piece, we have these closed eyes, but with the other two pieces, not only are the eyes open, but I'm using glass eyes that are manufactured by taxidermy companies. So there's this real kind of uncanny directionality to the gaze of the like the subject, I guess, and maybe a reciprocity in the way that a viewer would look at or to the sculpture, and the sculpture can look back and sort of meet that gaze. So I think that from here, I want to talk a little bit about how transgender bodies, and I will talk a little bit about how trans Jewish bodies and material practices merge together. And I want to do that by talking about my contemporaries, my colleagues, the way in which I sort of experience other trans artists representing or using bodies. I think it's very common for trans artists to talk about embodiment with bodies. And that might sound obvious, and maybe it feels obvious to me, but I think that in so much of my practice, I've had this focus or this real preoccupation with the idea of not using bodies, not using physical bodies to talk about transness, to talk about Jewishness, to find other ways and really complicate this relationship to embodiment. So I'm going to show some colleagues of mine. This is Zachary Drucker, who's a Jewish trans woman who lives here in Los Angeles with me. And in this piece, which is a performance that was then recorded, and then sort of the artwork lives as a recording, or like a video, I guess. Her body, this is her painted gold, and she's being slowly turned on a pedestal while this gallery attendant is wrapping and unwrapping her body. And while this is happening, a sort of meditation on her embodiment is playing in her voice as like an audio recording. And I think that this work in particular is doing this interesting thing about sort of placing a trans body in art history, in the museum space, and thinking about bodies as objects, but also bodies as artworks. Bodies really threaded into this relationship to objecthood. This is Tabaran Waxman, who is also a trans Jewish artist who does a lot of work around like photography and performance as well. Sort of, I feel like his work is really similar in that way to Zachary's. And I think like in particular, there's this real relationship to for Tabaran's work in performing these rituals, but then also documenting those rituals, and then the documentation of his body performing rituals become these kind of objects or like records or archives of his exploration of transness and Jewishness and how they maybe intersect. This is a performer named Puppies. And I think about this piece in particular for Art Basel, where she places a bronze sculpture of her naked body in public, and then approaches the sculpture and sort of caresses it, puts makeup on it, sort of creates this real like intimacy with objects and touch. You know, there's this idea that we as artists are making things, but I think there's also this kind of tender cultivation of objects in space that's happening as well. And so there's a real, I think with this work in particular, kind of awareness of what it is to be kind of visible in one's otherness, and the sort of tenderness in kind of community dynamic that can be possible here. This is Castles, who has been doing this body of work where they sort of attack, I guess, a very large block of clay as a performance, and the clay, being this sort of soft and malleable material, receives all of the violence of this attack. And the viewers, the kind of audience of this performance are also encouraged to document the work with flash photography. And in this completely dark space, the flashes are the only illumination of what's happening sort of around them. So these photographs become records of this violent act, this violent sort of performance, but then also that piece of clay gets cast in bronze, and then the bronze sculpture has traveled internationally for exhibitions as this kind of record of the performance, of the violence, but also as this kind of monument to that experience. And I think in this work in particular, I get really excited about what's possible in talking about transness and talking about trans embodiment without actually using a body as that representation. And this is a project by Chris Vargas called the Museum of Transgender History and Art, or MOTHA. And this body of work, this ongoing project, is a conceptual museum project where Chris sort of invents or fabricates this idea of a museum that is sort of dedicated to trans history that doesn't actually exist anywhere. It's a conceptual kind of non-physical museum space. And the work is really talking about trans access to resources, trans access to institutions, and what it means to kind of record transness, or like what trans history or history looks like. And so this is an amalgamation of crowdsourced trans heroes. So Chris asked for people to nominate their people's trans heroes, and without editing at all, or curating, really, Chris just, heard the nomination and then pasted it into this broadside, this large print. So there's, Tinky Winky is down in sort of the lower right corner, the Teletubby, and Peppermint Patty is in the top left corner. A seahorse is in the top left corner. These sort of much broader ideas of what represents sort of trans iconhood, which is kind of special. And this is me in the bottom right corner, which is very sweet. Honored to be included. And so Chris and I have done a lot of work together. We've collaborated on work, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well, the ways in which we've collaborated in the MOTHA context specifically. But I'm gonna now just jump back to some older work of mine. I had been making what I thought of as queer ritual objects for a while, thinking about trying to sort of, I think, brainstorm ways in which queerness, or the idea of queerness and transness, could be ritualized, and what a queer ritual might look like. And something that really stood out to me was this idea of rioting or revolution is this kind of thread through queer history. And so then the question became what are the tools, what are the ritual objects of revolution? And so I came up with this idea of the Molotov cocktail and the brick as being these kind of interesting revolutionary tools that also exist as something else, with a prior sort of less revolutionary purpose before they become recontextualized as violent weapons. And what would it mean to fabricate these objects with queer and trans history and kind of culture in mind? So I was glaze painting images of on these jugs, and also researching the ways in which floral patterns, or specifically specific flowers, are used to discuss or sort of identify queerness. So these pansy patterns became really significant in my work, doing a lot of like carnations and lavender and these flowers that have like kind of even just a linguistic reference to queerness. These are, I would say, early queer ritual objects that I was making in my undergraduate work, and really was kind of the first time I started experimenting with ornamentation and surface painting as this important kind of significant way to incorporate, maybe not with this work, but ultimately incorporate kind of symbols. I think of it as kind of conceptual ornamentation, this idea of like not just using any flower, but using flowers that have a conceptual weight to them. So this was really kind of the first time I did that. And it's just kind of snowballed from there. So this work was the first time that I collaborated with Chris Vargas as the Museum of Transgender History and Art. I made these pieces as well as some other kind of similar objects for an exhibition called Trans History in 99 Objects that was shown at the One Gay and Lesbian Archives at University of Southern California here in LA. And I think here I was really trying to think about vesselhood as really like a general, like non-specific experience, and really the vessel as a vehicle for surface painting and for recording of history. And this was, I would say, some of the first moments that I tried to find ways to blend both queerness and Jewishness and also alchemy and these kind of esoteric practices together in the same object by compiling images and symbols and patterns. This was another collaboration with Martha. It was for the 50th anniversary of the Gene Compton's cafeteria riot in San Francisco, which was a riot that happened 3 years prior to the kind of most famous Stonewall riots, where trans women, sex workers, folks living in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco who would sort of spend time at the Gene Compton's cafeteria, just like an all-night diner in this neighborhood, who would then be kind of like roughed up by police day to day, sort of fought back one evening. But the material and really kind of like cultural, I guess the cultural material was really poorly archived for this event. And so in doing research, there was very little material to consider and engage. And it became this body of work that I've since started to refer to as like a neo-archival object, the idea of making objects with the intention of them acting as archives themselves or being placed into archives ultimately. So, you know, hearing that like a diner was the site of a riot, of a sort of trans-led riot, my sort of ceramics brain immediately is like, oh my gosh, like dishes as riot tools. Who has Compton's cafeteria dishes? And not being able to find any, the idea was to make them. I would thrift diner style mugs and put these custom decals on them. I released them to the public, to really like the community, as commemorative objects, but then also these mugs, or, you know, I think 2 of the mugs were placed into the GLBT historical archives in San Francisco as an archival object. So this kind of layering of history and sort of what is authentically historical, I guess. So this is Gay Liberation by George Segal, which is in Christopher Park outside of the Stonewall Bar in the West Village in New York. And this sculpture historically has gotten a lot of pushback by the queer community. And especially like in the recent past, like in maybe the last like 10 years or so, there's been a lot of really vocal pushback. And I guess there's been a lot of vocal pushback about sort of monument building in general as a practice. But this piece in particular, a lot of the criticism was around the kind of normativizing of queerness, of like queer community, the literal kind of whitewashing of these objects as a representation of the whitewashing that occurs in kind of historicizing the queer community, and really the erasing of the trans women of color who really led the Stonewall riots. And the new museum in New York reached out to Chris Vargas as the executive director, quote unquote, of the Museum of Transgender History and Art, and asked him to do a show, maybe propose a new monument in its place. And instead, Chris rerouted the funds from that exhibition and commissioned a number of trans artists to make proposals for to stand in for the Gay Liberation Monument. Sorry, a bus driving by. I was, very honored to be one of those artists. So this is the proposal that I made for this exhibition. And I really was interested in considering, again, this sort of idea of like a non-human relationship to transness. And I think like the idea of a brick or a brick pile as a monument felt like this exciting moment to play around with what it means to memorialize, but also sort of monumentize an event that is sort of like slippery or complicated, I guess, in the way that it's been historicized. So this is really this idea of what I refer to as like a dissolving monument, a brick pile that would not be fixed and therefore could fall apart, could be like taken away by people, and would ultimately just kind of like disappear entirely at some point. So this is the drawing that I did. And this on the left is the 1/7 scale model that I made. And then on the right, I did also a 50-piece edition because it was the 50th anniversary of Stonewall that this was kind of anchored around, but you can see also what a 1/7 scale brick looks like. And I made them out of earthenware ceramic. So I tried to produce them in as accurate a process as possible. And I think like also something that came up here was this idea that like the brick is designed in direct reference to an sort of quote unquote average human hand. And so a brick is inherently talking about its relationship to a body without needing to represent a body directly. And it's been kind of an ongoing, exciting thing for like a brick to be a stand-in for embodiment, I guess. Let's see. Okay, so here's another kind of iteration of those glaze bricks that I was talking about earlier as these like riot tools or ritual objects. And this was really a moment in my practice where I started to move away from this idea of like a floral pattern as representing queerness, but thinking about fungus and mushrooms as a stand-in or like a metaphor for queerness. And that sort of fungus quality, fungus as queerness, fungus as otherness, I guess, has been a really present part of my practice in the recent past. The origin of this interest was really my discovery of this children's book that was a piece of Nazi propaganda, but really acted as a field guide of how to identify Ashkenazi bodies in a sort of majority Aryan space. And the text really works in this way to sort of say like, like in this narrative that this image is depicting on the right, like a child says like, "Mom, can I eat this mushroom?" And she says, "No, you can't eat every mushroom you find because it might be poisonous, just like you can't trust every person you meet because they might be a Jew." And for me, there was this real kind of fascination with the fact that this book is using mushroom or mushroomness as a metaphor to talk about assimilation and to talk about visibility, or like really a shifting visibility, which to me feels like a really fascinating parallel to queerness and transness. And so this idea of the mushroom became a really exciting symbol, metaphor, subject for me, and comes up a lot. My first kind of desire after finding that book is to make what I thought of as non-human figures, to make kind of like fungal figures, and to really try to fill space with them and let them be kind of gestural and having this kind of anthropomorphized quality to them, but still existing very much as these kind of wild, proliferating organisms in space. I also was trying to find ways to push on what I think of as kind of the boundaries of a body. And so pushing the interior to the exterior, thinking about what's possible in the boundaries, or really lack of boundaries, of a body. How do objects interact with each other? How do figures interact with each other or interact with the world around them? And I think this boundarylessness, or maybe pushing on boundaries, is something that I see a lot in my interest in mikvah and interest in water and water rituals. So I'm going to kind of slide back into this conversation around mikvah. Like I mentioned, I consider really like all aspects of my cultural intake to be research, and laying in bed and watching Sex and the City is not insignificant in that kind of position. So in season 6 of Sex and the City, there's this really kind of fascinating depiction of one of the characters converting to Judaism over the course of multiple episodes. And I had grown up watching this TV show as like a teenager, but when I rewatched this, I guess in my sort of 20s, mid-20s, when I sort of was revisiting the series, I saw this image and immediately was shocked by the idea that the tile of a mikvah, a tile of a bathing space, makes that space, but also the mikvah itself within the language of ceramics. And so I became very excited by this idea and started to make what I think of as mikvahs themselves, and really trying to find the boundaries of what is and is not a mikvah. So I think a lot of the smaller vessel work was doing that, but there was a point where I became really excited about scale and trying to make mikvahs that were much more directly in relationship to the size of a human body. So this is very large. You can like get into this, like a body can get into this vessel. And I think that playing with kind of construction, but also the integrity of an object in the way that this vessel form comes apart into all of these individual sections is this kind of ongoing theme, really letting objects lose their integrity by kind of breaking them with seams. This is a detail image of the interior of this vessel that I was making. And I think with this work, I was trying to think about in alchemy, the practice of what's often referred to as like a Western mandala, or in alchemy, referred to as an alchemical mandala, as this kind of often circular description or depiction of alchemical processes that's sort of loaded with symbols. And so I'm really trying to place the trans body or a trans body in a narrative of holiness and divinity. And so with this image, it's like an androgynous body. I refer to this figure as like the androgyne or an androgyne, but the androgyne is a kind of like icon, harvesting mushrooms and becoming mushrooms, sort of circularly, as this kind of transness as a space of enlightenment, I guess. So in this vein of seams and the integrity of an object, I also was making a body of work that I was able to do at a residency at the Kohler factory, Kohler, like the plumbing appliance company where I was, the residency is on the factory floor, and I was able to collect the waste of the production of sinks and toilets and urinals and bidets, and make things out of the material process in the factory. And I was making what I refer to as sort of Frankenstein washing devices, lavers, these forms that are about washing, but also affirming a trans body. But I'm making them out of appliances that hold all of this weight as really like oppressing trans bodies, as sort of designing, categorizing bodiliness in sort of normative bathroom spaces, but I'm sort of cutting them up and reassembling them into affirming washing devices, I guess. So after I had been making this work, I was really starting to become interested in trying to find ways to blend this body of work, which I think of as sort of the built world, or sort of like, objects, like these kind of washing devices, whereas the fungus work being these kind of like organic, abstracted organisms. I think I was curious, like, could I find a way to like push these bodies of work into each other? And I really kind of sat with this for a long time. And then through my kind of organic research, came upon the what's referred to as the molten sea, but it's the baptismal font that's used in Mormon temples. This is like the design that gets used in every Mormon temple, and it's called the molten sea and is appropriated from Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. This space holds 150 baths worth of water in a large vessel, and then that vessel is placed on the backs of 12 life-size oxen, life-size cast iron oxen. And I had an opportunity to visit the Mormon temple in Oakland during a rededication period, and I went to see this baptismal font for research. And something I was really struck by was this idea of a hybridized form, a vessel that is in relationship to like the natural world or organisms around it. And so after sort of finding this, I began to try to experiment with creating what I thought of as like hybrid objects. So I was making forms, this tank in particular, resting on, a cloud or a sort of mass of fungus, an object sort of turning into fungus or fungus turning into an object, this kind of bleed together of the natural world and the kind of constructed world. That work sort of led me to making some smaller, more manageable sized objects. These stands for 5-gallon buckets that are sort of doing a similar hybridizing. This bucket is sort of like one of my prized possessions. I used to work at a very San Francisco, like worker-owned natural food store in San Francisco, and there were bulk pickles there, and all the pickles would arrive in these amazing like Bubby's 5-gallon buckets, and I was able to take one home one day, and it shows up in a lot of my work because it's just such a like specific and kind of on the nose object. I just like love it so much. But I had found through, again, research, I was involved in some Talmud study, and a colleague of mine mentioned their involvement with the Hever Kadisha at their local synagogue. And we were talking about the kind of washing practice, the tahara practice of washing bodies before burial. And naturally, in my sort of ceramics sculptor brain, the question was like, what is the vessel that you use to wash a body? And this colleague was like, oh, they're, Home Depot 5-gallon buckets. And I was so kind of shocked by this, by the kind of insignificance of a kind of industrial plastic orange 5-gallon bucket, that I think my first instinct was like, oh, I should make significant vessels. And then I sort of like pulled back and was like, or like maybe there's significance in the utilitarian quality of the plastic bucket. And so maybe instead of making new buckets, I find ways to kind of like raise up, exalt, put value on the plastic buckets themselves. So the bucket stands became that practice, or that sort of answer question maybe. And then in this image on the left, as I began to exhibit these pieces, I started to think about ways that I could build them into the space that I'm showing them in. So these kind of bizarre, like lumber connected pedestals, and then bags of salt water that hang from the ceiling and drip slowly into the buckets, create this kind of relationship to like the ceiling and this kind of whole universal relationship to the architectural space. And so this idea of like incorporating the architectural space then sort of like, I would say maybe finally brings me sort of circling back to this most recent body of work, These are installation images in Lyon of the figurative work that I've been making. And I think before I made these pieces, I had a friend and collaborator who really recognized how much I was like kind of avoiding making figures. You know, like the 5-gallon bucket to me is like a way to talk about pouring water, or, you know, similar to the brick is like designed to be lifted and therefore speaks to the capacity of a body. And this friend was like, I see you avoiding making figures. It feels so clear that you're trying to not make figures. Maybe it's time to just like try making some figures and see what happens. And so this exhibition opportunity was that experience. I think that with this work, I've just been so fascinated by the way that the space, or the kind of interior space that these objects are installed, become just as significant as the objects themselves. They kind of like make the architecture complicit or active in the ritual that's occurring that a viewer would sort of encounter. So they were placed in this really long, dark hallway of Musée Guimet, which is a natural history museum that's been sort of falling apart and not used for the past like 15 years. And it was taken over by the Biennale to install work into, and really kind of special to put these objects into a natural history museum, and I think maybe recontextualize this space. Really kind of consider how the figures operate in space, but also how they operate in this building, in the world, in their bodies, etc. So this is where I'm at now with my work, and really kind of what I'm pushing off of to start to kind of explore for future shows. Yeah, and we'll just kind of see what happens. Yeah, so I think that's it. That's all the slides I have for you. It's just about an hour. So maybe I'll stop sharing. And yeah, come back to you all.
Nicki, that was amazing. That was amazing. Oh my God. Thank you so much. And there's some comments in the chat that you might want to look at too. And you feel open to answering questions?
Yeah, we'd love to chat.
All right. Did you make that mug?
I didn't. An old housemate of mine made this for me. Yeah.
It's nice.
Thank you.
The work is very, very, very powerful. Would anybody like to ask a question?
I noticed that one of the elements in the arc of your career seems to have been going from very pretty and smooth objects to more aggressive, sometimes unformed, sometimes very apparently casually formed items. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that I mentioned like kind of earlier on in the talk, this kind of relationship or complicated relationship to precision, which is something that comes up a lot in ceramics, and the kind of practice of ceramics is about the acquisition of skills and employing those skills. And so I think there's an intuitive desire, especially in sort of like young ceramic artists or sort of early ceramic artists, early in their experience with clay, to feel this kind of urge or need to create a sort of precise, smooth, like refined, it often gets talked about as like a clean surface. It's like worked over to create a precise environment. And I don't think that I'm separate from that maybe cultural value-based drive, but I think I'm aware of that. And so for me, with my work, I've always considered, or maybe like always meaning like in the recent past, like been really aware of that and trying to employ it as like a move, like a technique, using like flatness or using smoothness as a vehicle for images, and then contrasting it with like, right, this kind of like, I always sort of go like this when I think about like working with clay, and it's about sort of like squeezing material and sort of being gestural and loose and sort of quick with it, because that's ultimately something else that clay does, is that it responds to touch, and records movement. Like the castles piece of like the like punching of clay, it like receives the movement into it, and so to me they like play off of each other so well. It's like such a contrast that I get really excited about having a smooth form that then is broken by this kind of like craggy, cellular, rough form. Yeah, thanks for noticing that.
Nikki, on the mikvah lady,
Uh-huh.
um, she had that mushroom stuff. Was that, and actually the figure who's immersing themselves in the mikvah also had that. So that was they right? Am I right? They were the mushroom imagery was coming up there.
Yeah, I sort of like laugh when you refer to her as a mikvah lady because I also do that, but I'm so frequently making this work and talking about this work in not just like secular context, but in like, you know, Christian majority context, that like calling her a mikvah lady has no recognition, like people don't know what that means. But yeah, I mean, to me, it's like all of the figures, the idea was that they are like the components visible, the visible components are like human figure architecture, like they're kind of standing on these or squatting on these or sitting on these like platforms. So human architecture, and then fungus, and that the fungus is really kind of bleeding together everything, and that it's all happening maybe not evenly, but it's happening across all of them, that all of these figures are sort of turning into fungus and turning into furniture, and kind of all bleeding together.
Well, it's interesting too, because fungus, a mushroom in the form of mushrooms, very healing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many metaphors to me that like speak to not just like queerness and transness or Jewishness, right? Like otherness, but like togetherness. Like mushrooms are connected via like their mycelial threads, like a network below the surface of the forest, and they connect to other organisms to sort of share mineral resources. There's like so much beauty in thinking about the power of fungus. And so that's why, you know, that text, that poisonous mushroom propaganda text is like horrifying, right? Like these really kind of upsetting caricatures of Jewishness. And then also when you think about this act of calling a Jewish person a poisonous mushroom as like a kind of offensive or like, marginalizing act. There's also like something kind of profound about thinking about like mushrooms as like beautiful and interconnected and like powerful, and maybe like an organism that's going to like save the, climate catastrophe. Like there's so much to think about in actually like reappropriating like oppressive propaganda and using it to like empower communities. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting because they've always been thought of as this thing you had to get rid of. And all of a sudden people are realizing, oh, the thing we wanted to get rid of is actually, yeah, it's very
Right.
interesting to unpack all that.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question?
I have just maybe a comment, or just thank you so much for this. It's so just seeing your work, but also as you pulled in other artists' work, and just helped me kind of understand the broader context, or some more context. But I was really thinking a lot about your mikvah work, and I love that you just, and hearing you talk about, but also I love that you focused on the actual people, the actual figures, because of what I know of the mikvah, when I think about it, it seems to be about the opposite of focusing on the person. It's, it's like, it's like the person, the people are incidental. It's all about, it seems like it's about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. What's clean, what's not clean, what's kosher, what's not kosher. And so I don't know, by having just the figures there with some of their eyes kind of looking out at us, it's like, who is it that is determining what is right? Who is it that's determining who's reaching that place? Okay, now you're sacred enough to go back into, or you've been cleansed enough to go back into this other relationship. And so it's like, here is the room watching, or the people that are seeing the exhibit, who are those people? So it just feels like it turns the idea of the mikvah inside out in a way that's really interesting to just to think about and sit with, who's acceptable and who's not, and who's determining that, so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that too, or.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting, because when you started talking about the incidental quality of the figures or the bodies in the mikvah, at first I was kind of like, well, I mean, like, isn't mikvah only, like, doesn't it, like, it operates, or it's created to purify, to cleanse bodies themselves. So the bodies are in some ways like kind of central, but it is, I totally agree with you, as you were sort of explaining more, that maybe it's more about these kind of broader ideas of right, like cleanliness, like, but these like binaries, right? Like clean, unclean, kosher, yeah, that like inside, outside, like in the mikvah, outside of the mikvah, like immersi mikvah lady. Like there's this kind of like binary relationship to how it gets used, and how these ideas sort of get kind of centered in the discussion or engagement with mikvah. And yet, like, I just think so much about how mikvah is about liminality. It's about like moving through boundaries, right? Like like breaking the surface of the water as an act of transformation. A lot of I was just giving a talk the other night on fermentation as like kind of a like magic practice, or as like a ritual practice, I guess, fermentation. And fermentation also often gets referred to as like culinary alchemy. And I was talking to some folks in the class that I was visiting about like, maybe like transness as this idea of like gender alchemy, but also like, to me, it's like there's some kind of alchemical process happening inside the mikvah as well, that like it gets used for these like very kind of rigid, firm ways of being in the world, but is ultimately about transformation and the of like shifting and sort of movement, maybe like in a less kind of like physical way of the body in space. So yeah, I love that. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
There's such an inherent contradiction in the mikveh as it's traditionally thought of, because, on the one hand, the party line is, women don't have to do these mitzvot, they can't lead services, they can't do all these things because their job is to have babies. And then when they have their period, the very thing that allows women to have babies, they have to be purified from that state.
Yeah.
So the inherent contradiction in the mikveh, and then to really just reconceive it in the way that you do, is really, it's very interesting. And I think it's very important, because it opens the door for, and certainly more progressive Jews have done this, but you really help the process. It opens the door to really rethinking what the mikveh could be in terms of transformation and alchemy, as opposed to reinforcing a binary and misogyny.
Yeah. Yeah. I so agree with that. And I just think that there's so much possibility there. I mean, to me, it's like, it's again, this idea of like taking something that can be or is inherently oppressive. Maybe the mikveh is not inherently oppressive, but when I think about like the poisonous mushroom, or, like a reference that I think about a lot is like the organization ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, that looked at the pink triangle as this marker for like gay men in the Holocaust, and to take that pink triangle and to literally like invert it and then put it on a sort of call to action. And so then the pink triangle becomes, in some ways like synonymous with queer connectivity and revolution and togetherness. So it's like that act of taking something oppressive and reappropriating it as something collective and empowering. And I guess that's in some ways what was so exciting to see when I came upon queer and trans Jews using mikveh. It's like, in an Orthodox context, like trans bodies would not like be able to safely like use these spaces, and then to, in some ways like distill down the rituals to their most like elemental forms, and then like use them to affirm and engage transness, is so beautiful and empowering.
Yeah, it's really quite something very, very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Lynn.
Good evening. First of all, I want to thank you, Donna and Nicki, for an education that I know I needed and would love more of. And I wish there had been 100 people in the room tonight. It really was important. And a second comment, I got really excited each time you, Nicki, said that you got really excited having encountered something new to you, or framing something differently than you'd seen it before. And I found it fascinating how you juxtapose that image for us with the work that ultimately evolved from that that light bulb moment that you had or the trigger to make you think about something new, because I have absolutely no talent whatsoever in visual anything, but I am somewhat talented with music and writing. And I'm going to take that inspiration with me. So the next time that I notice something that lights me up or makes me think about the world in a totally new way, I think I'm going to understand differently that I don't need to use that inspiration in a literal way. I can use it as a launching pad. And I never really thought about it that way. I was interested by how different your work was from the thing that had inspired it. So I really wanted to let you know that was a super effective part of your presentation this evening, and really something I'm going to think more about in the future. And lastly, I put it in the chat already, but seeing the gay liberation sculpture again, I last encountered that in person in the 80s when I was in college, and I rode my bicycle by it during the times when it was not in storage because it had been vandalized. And it was, I had a very strong emotional response to seeing it again. And I know you used it as an example of a sculpture that didn't quite achieve what it should have, and it left out really important factual information and groups of people. But it also was, I had such a strong response to it. I'm going to go back and remind myself. And I was not out to myself at all in college. So but yet I knew that I had an emotional response to that sculpture each time I passed by it in my daily life. So now as an older person, I'm gonna have to look into it again to see how I perceive it differently. And so that will also be another lesson I take from this. And finally, you've given me a way to look at sculpture where I didn't really know how, honestly. I just don't have that natural ability. So the next time I go to a museum and I feel confounded by a sculpture, I'm going to stand there just a little bit longer and see if I can see the different elements and think about what the artist might have been pondering at the time. Even if I don't like get it, maybe I'll have a little bit more patience with myself about how to approach it. So you really, like I said, this was an amazing education on so many different levels. So thank you very much. And I'll stop talking now.
Lynn, thank you so much for all of that. That was so, it's so exciting to hear about, I mean, all of these things, but some of the things that are kind of like, sticking out to me are, well, I guess like maybe like in terms of gay liberation, I was just thinking about how, I mean, I'll be like completely honest, like I have a huge appreciation and kind of visceral attraction to George Segal's work generally. And to me, there's something profound about putting like gay figures in the world with no separation between a viewer and an object. I think it's gorgeous work, and I very much feel like that figurative work is inherently like affecting the way that I think about making figures. And I also recognize the need to be critical around monument making. And I think that those things can exist together in conflict with each other. I feel no qualms about like loving something that is not perfect and feeling inspired by something that is imperfect. And then I guess I'll just say that I'm also a teacher. I teach ceramics at Cal State Long Beach, and something that I'm constantly talking to my students about is that like art making, ceramics, or any other practice, writing, music, etc., in my mind are just ways to process and then synthesize information. And so I often will sort of say to students, like what are you actually interested in outside of like the ceramics classroom, and how do you bring that into the context of ceramics, but also how do you like make about those things that you are interested in? And so the idea of like, yeah, sort of giving energy to or significance to everything that you are excited by, and then processing them through whatever creative practice you're engaged with, to me is like such an important and beautiful part of being in the world, but also like part of being an artist, like being creative, you know, is like getting to synthesize or explore, ask questions through the lens of our practices, like writing, music, sculpture, etc. So thank you, Lynn. That was great.
You know, we have to end, but I want to say, and does anybody have a one final question that they want to, that they're burning, really hot to ask? I want to say that in all the times I've heard artists speak, I have never or done I've seen artists do a slide presentation like this. I have never seen anybody include the work of other artists. And I think that, and Jenny mentioned it, and I think that it just really speaks to not only your brilliance as an artist, but your graciousness as a human being. And you really, I started off by saying this was a Hanukkah gift to the community, but it was even more of a gift than I even imagined. I mean, really, Nicki, your work is spectacular. The way you talk about it is beautiful, and your beautiful presence. I feel like my heart is so full. I can't think of a better way to approach Hanukkah and the holiday season and the new year than with your words in my heart, and your being in my heart and your art. So I really, from all of us, I think I really speak for all of us. Thank you so much. I really feel like that day that I read the story in the forward was a really lucky day.
Thank you, Donna, so much. And thank you, everybody, for coming. This was so lovely to get to share and think through my practice with all of you, and for such great, stimulating conversation. It's been really lovely.
We hope that you'll come back, that this will be an ongoing relationship with you.
Yeah, would love that.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. It's great.
Thank you. It was really wonderful to spend this time with you. And sign up for our newsletter. We got really cool stuff going on, and Nicki's going to come back, I'm sure. We really want you to. Blessings. Okay. Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Solstice. Whatever you celebrate, I hope it brings you tremendous joy, and may the new year bring you blessing. Thank you all so much. Lots of love.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicki.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Minu.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good night.
Thank you.
You too.